So my name is David Ralston, and my relationship with Vietnam War stems from my father, Richard Ralston, who's still alive, still with us, who served in Vietnam War in the early '60s. So I'm going to answer your questions from the point of view not only growing up hearing or not hearing from him, but also growing up. I was born in 1966, so pretty much as the war was um, getting into, increasing and living, growing up in the shadow of that war. So it impacted me in a lot of different ways growing up through the 60s and the 70s. So I'm going to be talking from that perspective. Um, so I grew up born in Los Angeles, California, but I also lived in New York, Rochester, New York. And so we always knew, me and my brother, heard stories that my dad was in the Vietnam War, like I said, from the early '60s, and often would wear his military, green jacket with the stripes on, and occasionally let us know what happened in the war. But even beyond that, what was interesting is how much we were the war was raging in the background, but how much of that didn't really, it only came through in intermediate waves in terms of daily life. I remember distinctly seeing army trucks driving down the highways in the United States with newly minted soldiers coming from the boot camp, getting ready to be sent off. So we were distinctly aware that this whole buildup was going on around us. The nightly news at the time, was black and white TV back then, so we'd always see stories of footage of Vietnam and Walter Cronkite and reports of various massacres and shootings, and as well as the protests. So all of this was swirling around, and I think you'll find out. I mean, my father, his experience, what we learned as kids was you don't ask questions about it. He doesn't want to talk, he doesn't want to talk about it. Otherwise, he would be here being interviewed instead of myself.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot of trauma, post-traumatic things that have to be reconciled with, even though he was there pretty much early on, and you can ask more questions. You can kind of ask more questions as you go along. But one thing that was very personal in the war was one of my friends growing up. His father, his father was well known as one of the scientists at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Mass Science Building, who was killed during a homegrown bombing by anti-war protesters at the University of Wisconsin. So people blew up the Mass Science Building because of its affiliation with
War itself.
The war efforts. And we learned that they thought, I think it was the Weather Underground, they assumed that the Mass Science Building was empty. It was like 2:00 in the morning, but this guy Chris Fosnot, his dad was the only one doing research in the building, and unfortunately perished in that explosion. So
goodness.
Yeah, so that really brought home, like, wow, this this war going on halfway around the world has these kind of ramifications that we had to made us ask questions and try to understand what's this all about.
Right, because it hits so close to home, even though have direct association with the war. That's great. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. And another way that it impacted me growing up was immediately, I think right after the war, there was a lot of Vietnamese refugees who came to America. So I began to get acquainted with a lot of families. I was living in Wisconsin at the time, and so a lot of refugees came in, and so some of my friends at the time, Tron and his family, so all of a sudden we're growing, we're as Americans exposed to new Vietnamese culture for the first time. I've heard stories. A lot of people, Vietnamese, went to Louisiana because of the shrimp fishing industry, and different parts of the country. I guess Orange County, obviously, but that was so to have friends and their family, and just the air about what they went through, and that's kind of surrounding them, and you just feel this. Um, you can just feel the kind of lingering impacts of the war, even though they had to escape. And it just, if you're in America, it's a different kind of experience that we're sheltered from. When you look back at the history, I mean, the war started getting really bad, 1968, early 70s. So I saw the news flash, like told you, saw the caravans of soldiers. Um, but at that time, as kids, you could easily turn the channel, and I think my dad and parents did that on purpose. This was the start of Sesame Street and some of these, shows like that are really, putting you into this whole brave new world, this whole, utopia kind of situation. So it's kind of just funny that we're being exposed to that. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, there are war protests on the campuses. There's, people getting shot at Kent State. There's, the different offenses and massacres in Vietnam, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers going. But yeah, you don't really. I didn't perceive that per se, and I know that my dad was, like I said, not. And you got to understand. Well, you got to understand. Let me back up too. My dad was. He's African American, a black man from the South, who went directly to Vietnam War from the South after trying to keep extending his deferment, but knowing that, very aware of the racism of the country, and very aware that, as a black man, he was much more, you know, targeted to get drafted, or not being able to, stay in different kind of school programs and things like that. So I think that experience in going to Vietnam and then coming back, which happened to a lot of soldiers, where they don't feel you come back, and then the peace movement is starting up, the anti-war protests, and people are, these images, people spitting on soldiers, and protesting the planes as they come back, and making so the soldiers would feel like they're being called traitors or this or that, by the hippies and whatnot. So it's like something, you just feel bewildered, and for him it was like a double antagonism, coming back to a country that's also going through the civil rights movement and then the anti-war movement. So it's not something that you want to come back and advertise that you were a Vietnam soldier, because you could get
on both sides.
Yeah, so in that respect, he didn't take us to, at that time I was at UCLA campus around there, and I don't know if there were sit-ins and things like that, and they did have groups like soldiers against the war and stuff like that, but we avoided going. I didn't go to any of those kinds of things as a kid, so I think that was pretty much intentional.